Okay, so here we are, chapter 12, last chapter of our book. It covers education and religion. Some of you that may have the hard copy, those are two separate chapters. In the soft copy from edition 11, those are one chapter. Starts off with education. Social institution responsible for the systematic transmission of knowledge, skills, and cultural values within a formally organized structure. So, of course, education in our society is handled by the formal organization of schools, public schools, private schools, colleges, K through 12. And we start off with the functionalist theory about why education performs and how it performs the function it does in society. So we start with a sort of Mertonian view, manifest functions, things that were intended. Socialization, got to make sure everyone raised in America understands American things, including goofy things like lies, like, again, George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. We all know that that's a lie, but it's sort of an American lie that we know as Americans. Transmission of culture, social control. It's actually one of the intentional aspects of the institution that we keep kids off the street. Can't have 8 to 17-year-olds running amok during the daylight hours. So school is there for social control. And also social placement. We learn where we fit in the world. Chances are, probably, we learned about class probably for the very first time while at school. You learned whether your family was middle class or working class or upper class. And lastly, change and transmission of innovation. Schools do that, so it becomes sources of innovation, new things coming up. Again, now it's very common for there to be openly out students in high school, which is great. Not too long ago, when folks were in high school, that was not an okay thing to be. But there's also latent functions of education. Some of that is to restrict some activities, matchmaking, and creating a gender gap. The matchmaking part is not that, again, it's latent, like it's a oops function. They weren't there trying to hook you up with dates. But the fact is, if I put a bunch of 9th through 12th graders all in the same building at the same time, they're going to start dating or hooking up or doing whatever they do. And then a generation gap is that at certain times, you start having what we call cohorts, groups of people, coming into school, and they all have that same similar experience there for those 4 years of school, creating an identity of people, let's say, that had an identity from 2010 to 2014 and 14 to, let's say, 18, and those that are in high school now, 18 to 22. Conflict perspective, again, much more suspect of the institution. They talk about the transmission of cultural capital. This is Bourdieu again. This is that French guy that we talked about way on back, beginning of the class, in which social assets, values, beliefs, attitudes, competencies are displayed in school, sorting out the different class groups. So again, knowing terms for, again, I use the example of yachting, tacking, and jibbing, and silly things like that, were only pieces of information that you would know if you have a big, expensive, slow boat that you need to sail. Normal people not near water or lakes or wanting slow boats that they would sail wouldn't have any of that knowledge. That's the kind of thing that people trade to identify each other. They also talk about tracking, assigning students to specific curriculum groups. Now, again, this was not intended originally to try to hurt a group of people. I mean, it started off with often a lot of very good intentions, trying to get special attention to students that were having difficulties. That being said, we find that, again, lower income students of color are often disproportionately put into those kinds of classes tracked for special education. Chances are you went to a high school that had like the regular class and the gifted and talented class, and then the slow class. And oftentimes the slow class was about attitude problems. I myself was put into a slow class. Some of you probably don't know. Surprised by that. Put into a slow class, not actually because I was having any academic problems, but because I was an attitude problem. They'll also talk about the hidden curriculum, specific kinds of ideas of like patriotism and viewing the world in a certain way. Again, conflict people say it's not a mistake that you learn to sit in your chair for 8 hours unquestioningly, to make it through the end of the day, very much like that we're going to expect you to do at work. And it's sort of like beating out of you any desire to, fight back or to try to change the system. And they say that that's intentional. Again, that we learn about the economy. Right now, people talk about the economy. Right now in the news, everyone's talking about the stock market. When over half of the United States isn't at all invested in the stock market, nor do they work for a company that's traded on the stock market. The stock market is not the economy. That's actually an idea less than about 60, 70 years old, in which the economy as a thing is represented by a metric like the stock market. The stock market is rich people trading pieces of paper for money so they can continue to capitalize. It doesn't have anything to do necessarily with how the economy is going. It has a lot to do with how those people, that top 1% is doing. And of course, right now, despite COVID and a pandemic, the stock market is still doing well because, again, finance capitalism is doing well. Symbolic interactionists point out about labeling and how when I label a student a certain way, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's the infamous brown eyes, blue eyes experiment that not only shows about labels, but how inherent an idea of like racism can be passed on by just how we treat certain groups of people in a differential way. They used to do IQ testing, which again, as we started from the very beginning of our course, your instructor questions the whole IQ thing. Because it was Genesis, it was never supposed to do the thing that they think it does. Problems of elementary and secondary schools. Number one is unequal funding. Most of your school district here in Texas is funded by local property taxes, not the state, not the Fed. Local property taxes, which means that rich school districts will always have more money than poor school districts if they just don't have the kind of housing. Like Austin has expensive housing. They're going to have a lot of tax dollars that, let's say, a city like Eagle Pass is just never going to have. It's just never going to have that median home income to charge that kind of taxes to get those kind of tax dollars. That's why we had the Robin Hood plan by the judicial system to try to equal that funding, and even that's now apparently gone awry. Another issue, school dropouts. In the graph that they put on there of dropouts for 16 to 24-year-olds, notice the highest, Native Americans, the second highest, Hispanics. And here in Texas, that's an even more alarming figure, particularly when you put in class and region. We have many more Hispanics from, let's say, San Antonio down to the border, not finishing high school, which means that we're losing a lot of folks that should be finishing high school, having a high school education, and they're leaving. And the reason they're leaving is not because they can't hack it. Often it's because their income is needed for their family's survival. Racial segregation. No, Brown versus Board of Education and the issues of desegregation. This is one of those, I'm not going to talk about it. Did you do the reading? Trust me, there will be Brown versus Board of Education questions on the test. Competition. This is, again, applying a sort of Adam Smith idea to schools, the idea of school choice, the issue of school vouchers. The idea was that schools would compete and that would make them better. And the issuing of school vouchers so you could take your kid out of a public school and take the tax dollars that you would necessarily have spent and take them and transmit them over to a private school. The problem is Milwaukee's been doing this for years and years and years, and we actually haven't seen a great deal of difference. But what we have seen is tax dollars taking out of the local school district and pumping up the parochial school system. That is considered a problem by many folks, taking that tax money and sharing it that way. Particularly since those schools can also say, they're an attitude of behavior problem. We won't accept them. Parochial schools could say no. They could say no to a special ed kid or a kid with Downs or a kid that's blind. Public schools don't have that option. There's also a big talk about charter schools. Current administration loves charter schools. I taught in a charter school. Charter schools on the East and West Coast are usually for like super high performing folks. In the middle part of the country, it's often for problems with, if your child is having problems with education, charter schools are there to try to help them out. But we're talking about 3 to 4% of all folks in school. Even if we tripled charter schools, they wouldn't be in a position to really help out the issues in education today. So what's the big about charter schools? They don't have to conform to teaching standards or building standards or things like that. And then we talk about homeschooling. And what do we find with homeschooling? Actually, we find homeschoolers do great, really, really smart. They often, though, also flame out, sadly, when they get to college because of the lack of socialization experiences with people from a diverse background that honestly school gives you. All right, so that's the end of Chapter 12, Part 1.